Es war mir eine große Freude. Es war mir eine Ehre. Herzlichen Dank.
Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Rutte. Ich bin Senior Forscher und Senior Research Fellow beim Klingendahl-Institut und ich fühle mich geehrt, die Diskussion heute Abend moderieren zu dürfen. Thank you all for joining our event on German-Dutch relations, Europe, and the new German government. The timing of this evening's discussion could not be better. Last week, the new German government took office, and for all your benefits, and entirely coincidentally, of course, the Dutch coalition partners waited until this afternoon before publishing their new coalition agreement, allowing us to take stock tonight, not only of the impact of the new German government on Europe, but also perhaps to already assess a little bit how the new Dutch government may relate to it. We have a fantastic panel of speakers that are going to make sense of new German-Dutch relations in a changing European context. The Netherlands and Germany are, of course, very close partners, geographically, economically, culturally, linguistically, politically, but what do we expect from each other? And what does the new German government expect from the new Dutch government, and vice versa? But before we get started, let me share a couple of house rules with you all. We will be addressing three themes, and our speakers will give short interventions to allow a dynamic conversation to emerge. Everything we say will be on the record. And of course, we're going to ask you, the audience, the participants, to chip in with your thoughts and comments as well. And to do so, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then that question will be visible to me. Now, I also have to make one organizational announcement. We are still waiting for the participation of two of our planned speakers. One is having an internet connection problem. We hope Jana Pudlirin from ECFR will join us quite soon. The other has a political engagement, namely a member of parliament for the Dutch Social Democrats, Katja Piri, who will join in about 20 minutes time, but has an urgent meeting, probably connected somehow to the new coalition agreement. But we think it absolutely makes sense to get started already. There's a lot to talk about. And before we dive into our three themes, which are very briefly how German foreign and security policy is going to develop, what the impact of Germany on the European Union and European monetary policy is going to be, and thirdly, how the German-Dutch relationship is going to evolve. As a matter of ice breaking, I wanted to ask all our speakers to offer their thoughts on what they think is most noteworthy, interesting, or remarkable about the new Coalitionsvertrag, about the new German government. So let me just introduce our speakers to you very briefly and put that question to them. let me first start with Ambassador Cyril Nun. Ambassador Nun is a relatively new ambassador here in The Hague, and is, of course, the ambassador of Germany to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Ambassador, it's fantastic to have you with us. I'm also aware that this is one of your first big public events here in The Hague and the Netherlands, and it's great to have you on board. But from your perspective, and you've served in the Foreign Office or in the Foreign Service for quite some time, what do you think is remarkable or surprised you perhaps most in the German Koalitionsvertrag? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I'm here. I hope you hear me. Thank you very much for having me with you. What was very interesting to follow is that these elections were won by two parties who are probably the most dynamic parties in Germany right now, the Green Party and the Liberal Party. And they managed to work out a Koalitionsvertrag where their imprint, both of them, is strong. And what really surprised me is that at the beginning of such negotiations, you would have thought this is water and fire. But it is not water and fire. These are two parties which in many ways are complementary, and they managed actually to put these complementary elements together in order to put a strong imprint on the Koalitionsvertrag. That, I would say, is what surprised me most.
And you think, and when it comes to water and fire, you mean the Greens and the FDP?
Yes, that's the two parties whom we have to remind won the majority of the votes of the young people, more than the established parties. And therefore, it's also a good sign that these parties representing the youngs, and who at the start were seen as parties being antagonistic, managed to found a good middle ground, which will be at the core of what Germany's government will deal with in the next years.
Let's now turn to either water or fire, depending how you see it. Mr. Otto Fricke, it's been also great to have you on board. You're, of course, a member of the German Bundestag for the FDP. You're the closest of all of us to what's happening in the new government and the formation of the coalition. What struck you most of the new, either the new agreement or the new government itself?
First, to stay in the picture of Ambassador Nunn, important with fire and water was how much and in what way is the steam used as energy that is coming out of that procedure. And here we go to one direction that is very important. I'm now, well, I don't like to say it, but I'm the longest standing member of the Free Democrats in this parliament, and I've been a senior advisor already at the times of Kohl. So I really have seen a lot of coalition talks, a lot of coalition treaties, a lot of results. I can even watch into some of the Dutch coalition treaties. I remember bridge building and some other things that we could see in the Netherlands. I see the new coalition treaty already, looked into it, found a lot of German things. But what was stunning, because it was for the first time, we really had a professional way of doing these coalition talks. First, we had a period of very short 2 weeks where we found out what the basics, what the goals of our politics have to be. And then we had a defined procedure that was really kept underneath the radar. A lot of journalists didn't like that, but the result really was a paper, 177 pages, not just 50 as in the Netherlands, but 177 pages that were agreed on. And that this professional way of doing it was, to my mind, really the thing that astonished me the most.
That's very interesting. It's also very good to see Jana join us. I hope she can hear me. We'll give her a couple of minutes to get herself sorted. Nikolai, as a think tanker, and you watch German foreign policy up close, but also, of course, European dynamics. what struck you most in the new coalition treaty?
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here. I would maybe name two things. Looking primarily for me as at the EU chapter, what struck me the most was that there was not a single mention of the word Zusammenhalt, so cohesion. And I think the Merkel years was all about Germany as a status quo power, especially after Brexit and Trump. The whole focus of German EU policy was about Zusammenhalt and keeping the EU together. And now that word isn't in the EU chapter, and the ambition is to fundamentally reform the EU. So I think the ambition, at least from the coalition treaty, is to turn Germany from a status quo power in the EU to a reform motor. And this is really a change of role in German EU policy. And the second one is more party political. If you look at the positions that the parties have in EU policy, most of the major positions are taken by the Greens. For a three-party coalition, that's quite remarkable, sort of for foreign affairs, but also for EU coordination for climate and economy. So the two major ministries who coordinate German EU policy are taken by the Greens. The Bundestag EU Affairs Committee is taken by the Greens, and they secured themselves the sort of the right to nominate the next German EU commissioner. So the core functions, at least for the legislative part of EU affairs, are taken by the Greens. But the real power center of German EU policies in recent years was the Chancellery. And maybe the finance ministry. So for me, it will be really interesting, how does that sort of formal power grab by the Greens about German EU policy work out in practice in a rivalry maybe with the Chancellery and the finance ministry?
Thank you. That's interesting, and we're definitely going to delve a little bit deeper into the new dynamics as Germany transitions from Zusammenhalt to being more reformist, as you say, Nikolai. René, over to you. I mean, for those who don't know, René Cuperes is amongst others a senior associate at the Klingendahl Institute, and he's written a fantastic paper in the run-up to the German elections. Also, what a new German government could mean for the Netherlands. So, from your vantage point as an observer of Germany, what did you think is most surprising of the dynamics over the past couple of weeks?
Okay, thank you, Rem. First, I want to say that it's a pity that we have to do this webinar in English, because so many Dutch people do not speak German anymore. And I think investment in German language might be a very good investment in German-Dutch relations in the future. That's my starting point here. What's most remarkable for me at the new German government is the fact that this German government contains no less than 4 foreign ministers. 4 foreign ministers. If you look at the personnel, we have 3 Green foreign ministers, Annalena Baerbock, but also Sam Özdemir, who is on the agricultural post, is also a foreign policy expert. We have Robert Habeck, who is very outspoken about Ukraine security crisis. And of course, we have the Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So there are 4 people dealing with foreign affairs, or who have very serious foreign affairs skills, and that might be enormous strength of this new government. It could also be a risk that all this foreign policy expertise is in this government, because there might be a contrast with the domestic mission of this coalition. If you look at the energy and the boost of this Fortschritt coalition, it's directed towards the domestic politics and not so much to foreign politics. So there might be a clash between the foreign policy expertise and the direction of the government. That would be my first observation here.
Let me immediately test your thesis with Ambassador Nunn. Ambassador, do you have the feeling that you have 4 bosses?
Well, we are serving everybody anyhow in the government, so I have actually far more bosses than. But I could say that I think also the finance minister is a foreign minister, and therefore the thesis is okay for me. And the balance of power will be definitely where the strongest impetus is, on which files the strongest impetus is. And for that one, I think we will see.
And let me just check if Jana can hear us. I mean, we can see you, but I have a feeling your audio might be still a little bit problematic. Okay, well, give me a sign when you feel comfortable chipping in. Let's continue this theme of Germany's new foreign policy. There's been a lot written and said already about the new wind blowing through German foreign policy, particularly with a minister of the Greens now being the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Perhaps you, Mr. Ambassador, can also shed some light on what kind of new policy priorities the new German Foreign Ministry sets for itself, particularly, if I may ask you, also on relations with great powers. So the relationship with Russia, China, and the United States.
Well, in the agreement of the government, you will have read that there is a relative scarcity of naming countries. There are not many named. And you will have seen also that the qualification of these countries depends very much also of the German legacy towards these countries. So the passes on Poland is very clearly written in the reality of our past with Poland, and with Russia the same. I start with that because on Russia, you have words which are rather door opening, while on China, the words are more stating facts of possible challenges. So if you read just the words, you might have the impression that some states are described in a different way when it comes to our interest in foreign policies than others. But in the real life, we have seen in the last 10 days that these two countries, among others, are posing huge immediate foreign policy challenges. So this is the real world. So immediately you have a counter check of what you write on the paper and how the counter word is. And the real world is that we are an Atlantic country, we are a NATO country, we have very strong relations to the United States, and the two other named countries are challenges, everybody in his way. I read with big interest also the coalition agreement of the Netherlands, where you find exactly the same. You find exactly the same. You have MH17, you have China for the reasons we know, and you have the United States, which is the big partner.
Thanks for that. Let's see if we can bring Jana into the conversation, and let's see how your audio works. Jana Puglerin, head of ECFR's Berlin office, and a fantastic expert on not just German foreign policy, but European foreign policy writ large. I hope you can hear me. Can we hear your thoughts on whether a new wind is blowing through German foreign policy or not?
So I try my very best. I hope you can hear me without headphones. Okay. I'm deeply sorry for the technical turbulences. I have been away all day, just came back, and after 2 years of the pandemic, I mean, that was actually the first time that my internet connection really crashed. Anyhow, so that has nothing to do with the poor state of German infrastructure and the lack of reforms we have done in all things digital and infrastructure related, where I think the new government has a huge ambition to change things as well. When it comes to foreign policy, I see some fresh air and a new tone, especially when it comes to dealing with China or Russia. When it comes to Europe, I see some visions that haven't been there for 16 years, not widely shared, maybe amongst Europeans, but there is this idea to have a European federal state, which is, I think, something that we haven't heard under Merkel. The departure from Merkel's union method and the re-emphasis on the community method that we see in there. So I think when it comes to the EU, there is a new approach. And as I said, the vision is back. And when it comes to Russia and China and the systemic challenge between autocrats and Democrats, I think the Greens have put some tough wording into the coalition treaty. I see when it comes to implementing the treaty, I see still a lot of continuity, because German foreign policy, as I think ever since the German unification, has been driven by continuity. And I think the overall kind of big lines are still there: a strong commitment to European integration, transatlantic alliance, and NATO is in there very strong, very prominently. Multilateralism, rule of law. So everything Germany has stood for actually since 1990 is in there. But I think, yeah, the tone is different. And the emphasis is a little different. I think when it comes to Russia, it's a more realistic language. It's no longer aiming for a good or wonderful partnership, but it's more, the emphasis is more on stability. Although, of course, still it's about identifying islands of cooperation with Russia. And when it comes to China, I think the coalition actually went quite far in kind of mentioning Taiwan, mentioning Xinjiang, mentioning Hong Kong. So yeah, I think there is a shift, while there is also a lot of continuity.
Well, would it be fair to say that there is more of a shift regarding China than there is regarding Russia?
Many have argued this. So my colleague Janka Oertel, who does China, is very, very enthusiastic about the China chapter. But I think also in the Russia chapter, if you compare this coalition treaty with the previous one, as I said, it's more realistic wording in there. And of course, there is always some strategic ambiguity. And I mean, we have a member of parliament amongst us, but what I've heard from the negotiators of this particularly working group is that the Russia chapter was basically the hardest to agree on. So, but I think that also on Russia, we see a different tone. It's interesting that, for example, Nord Stream 2 is not mentioned explicitly. That has been very much criticized. There is this reference to European energy law. But what I think is interesting is that before the coalition treaty deals with Russia, it deals with Ukraine and the Eastern Partnership. And what I think is in there as well is a strong emphasis on Central and Eastern Europe, on the need to reassure these countries, especially also in the security chapter. There are I think the commitment to protecting Central and Eastern Europe and to take the security needs into account is very strong in this coalition treaty.
I saw you nodding in agreement, Mr. Fricke. Do you want to come in on this point?
No, just briefly, I think Jana is right. I think this is a quite precise analytic of what the discussions were. On Nord Stream 2, we really have to see you write down into a coalition treaty things where you show new ways or where you say this is how we're going to do it, but you don't write down where you don't really change anything. And this is the limbo that we do have still within the German politics with Nord Stream 2. The discussion on Russia is to my mind, the psychological on the Russian soul, on the question, how do you treat Russians on the one hand side, not too soft, but on the other side, of course, not too strict. That is not easy. And that was within in the group really something that we're discussing hard. Who, in what way, I will never tell.
Maybe just one observation, Rem. I mean, maybe that's a little, maybe that is interpreting too much into one small anecdote, but a couple of days ago, when I wake up in the morning, I used to listen to the radio, and there was an interview with SPD party group leader Rolf Mützenich while I prepared my morning coffee. And so he was asked a couple of questions, but then in the end it was about Russia and Nord Stream 2. And the interviewer tried to do a very good job in pushing hard to get an answer out of Rolf Mützenich. And she asked 3 consecutive questions. She tried various angles to basically grab him and to make him say something meaningful. And it was all about ambiguity, and it was all about de-escalating the situation on all fronts. It was kind of Germany as a mediator, a bridge builder. It was the emphasis was on détente, and that was very interesting. And the most interesting thing was at the very end of the interview, he said that he was sure that the German Chancellery would basically carefully craft a strategy for this. And that triggered an immediate reaction by a Green member of Parliament, Omid Nuripur, who is going to be, I think, quite certainly the new party leader of the Green Party, or one of the two. And he said, this is not the old Schröder-Fischer arrangement. That is not one is cooking basically the meal and one is serving it or selling it. This is different. There is this is not how we do things here. And I think that gave you a first idea of how contested the Russia file still is within the German government, especially how hard it still is for the SPD, how split the SPD is, because you also hear very different voices coming out of the SPD, much more critical voices. But and then that there will be definitely kind of this struggle, who will basically the driving force of the big portfolios when it comes to German foreign policy, China, Russia, United States, but also all things EU. Will they be driven by the Chancellery primarily, or will there be kind of some sort of work share? I think that is most interesting to watch.
Yeah, and of course, lest we forget, the German government has only been in office for a couple of days, and right in the middle of a crisis with Russia. So it's not surprising that this is also now very much under the magnifying glass. In that context, and I recommend it to anyone participating in this event to look at Minister Baerbock's sort of opening speech that she gave, I think 2 days ago. It's going to be very interesting to watch. Of course, we're watching this as well in the Netherlands. René, can I bring you in as not just an avid Germany watcher, but also a commentator on Dutch foreign policy? You might have had the chance to look at the Dutch coalition agreement, which doesn't mention Russia in any meaningful way, doesn't mention Nord Stream 2 either. How do you compare, if you will, what our German friends are saying and what you've been seeing here in Holland?
In the Dutch coalition agreement, you mean?
Yes.
On European affairs, especially, because
on Russia
on Russia, there's not so much on great power competition in the Dutch coalition agreement as I've seen. Now I'm much more interested in the overall tone of the Dutch coalition government agreement, which was surprising me because I was quite pessimistic. I was afraid for the Dutch to be isolated in Europe, isolated because of the disappearance of Sebastian Kurz, who was the big friend of Mark Rutte in the Frugal Four, and he was also because of the Franco-Italian pact in Europe that might isolate the Dutch. But if you look at the coalition agreement of the Dutch, you see a very constructive, positive tone, to my surprise, in European affairs and international affairs, which is quite impressive. And I think that's the influence of D66 in this coalition agreement, which should be heard also in Germany, that the tone of the Dutch in great power competition and in European policy is changing, and that there are openings which I did not expect.
And to what extent do you think that there is a parallel that Germany doesn't want to really take sides, for instance, in the relationship between China and the United States, nor does it want to really take a very clear, say, hard line on Russia? Do you see that mirrored in the Dutch context?
More or less, yes. They also speak about open strategic autonomy or sovereignty. So there's a kind of, my worry is that we are reacting too much instead of acting. Even I also see the Germans more reacting than acting in foreign policy, to be honest. If you look at Annalena Baerbock's speeches or interviews on the China boycott of the Winter Games or on Russia, it's quite cautious in the middle. And you see the same kind of caution in the Netherlands position, very ambiguous, and not the same as the strong position of Macron. If you look at his position on strategic autonomy, it's a much tougher line. And I see the Dutch and the Germans more reacting than having their own initiatives or ideas.
Can we test that with our German friends? I mean, Jana, do you agree that even, I mean, perhaps for the past 16 years, the Merkel government has been characterized by sort of leading from the middle, which is a sort of lingo for me to. It suggests to try to keep everyone together, but not really sticking your head above the parapet. Do you expect this German foreign policy to be more proactive or more forward-leaning on some topics? Or should we expect more continuity?
I'm curious to learn what Nikolai has to say about this and Mr. Fricke, but I would say that German foreign policy was very much driven by events, and Germany is no exception here, because, I mean, I think it's to a certain extent always an illusion that you have this, and of course you have a plan, you have the coalition treaty, you have some fundamental ideas, but then I think reality kicks in. And I just remember, for example, when the administration came in 2013 and gave the big speeches in Munich about Germany's new responsibility, that was not about leading Europe's answer to the annexation of Crimea. That was about, I don't know, 3 more Medivac Airbuses in the Central African Republic back then. That was the scenario. It was not really, kind of, nobody was really expecting what kind of challenges Germany would be confronted with shortly afterwards. So I think you can have this carefully crafted strategy, you can give big speeches. A year later, von der Leyen spoke about leading from the center. But I think German foreign policy was very much crisis-driven, and that also, I think, offered some opportunities for Germany. For example, the announcements in Munich, the new Munich consensus, as I said, in 2014, when the speeches were held, there was not so much substance behind it. But then it also paved the way then for Germany to do actually more and to move out of its comfort zone and to break some taboos. So the idea that the German that Germany would lead a battalion in Lithuania just shortly afterwards was absurd in 2013, or the idea that we would equip the Peshmergas with weapons and kind of send weapons into conflict zones was also another taboo that was broken. But that was not because of a change of mind. I think that was kind of the realization that one had needed to act in crisis, and I think that will continue. So I think, your strategy. It works only as long as everything goes according to plan, and I think the rest is to do it kind of walking and chewing the gum at the same time. And I see that very much also with the new government. Maybe, and I'm skeptical, but maybe Mr. Fricke tells me that I'm all mistaken. I'm not so sure how much appetite we have kind of to play this leadership role in Europe still. I still see a lot of reluctance amongst the political elites,
Mr. Fricke, by all means, because I also wanted to transition, perhaps that leadership role is going to be more in the EU rather than on the foreign policy stage. But over to you.
Well, it's the good old German question, leadership, which we Germans don't like, because you all know the translation in Dutch sounds good with Leidenschaft, but in German, this Führerschaft, it doesn't sound good because of the first part of the word. So just by saying that literally, Germany still is, so many years after World War II, very cautious, and here I agree a lot with Jana, on not being too much of a leader, not being too much in a leading role, either leaning, and this is what we see in the coalition treaty, leaning now a lot towards France, which personally I'm not quite sure whether you lean against a strong tree or whether it is something else you lean against. But it makes it really, really difficult for us to get in this position. And B, answer to your question, is it Europe? Yes, if you look at the coalition treaty and the urge of bringing more responsibility, especially in the foreign politics sector, especially in the defense sector, towards Europe, then for sure, this is one of the solutions. And yes, you were right. that it looks, by the sound, it looks as if the new coalition treaty leads more into we're stepping forward. If we go to the Dutch coalition treaty, and this is how I remember it, if we just have, the old part was omzien naar elkaar, the new part, the new coalition now is vooruitkijken naar de toekomst. And I think you can see that split really in the coalition treaty now, and the one that was there for the last 4 years.
And Nikolai, you mentioned in your opening comment that you expected a more reformist-minded Germany in a European context. Where do you expect that, and what do you think that's going to mean for the rest of the EU?
I think two parts of an answer to that. The first is sort of the signal policy in the EU chapter is that it starts with that huge vision of a federal European state, which is, as far as I know, the first time a German coalition treaty mentioned that, even though we had federalists in German government for a long time. But for me, that's a little bit like the European army that used to be in a lot of previous coalition treaties. So a far away vision that has been put there, if I may say so, by the EU politicians in the three parties, but it's not a core agenda of the government. So I don't see Chancellor Scholz going to his first European Council this week and saying, I want to go to the path towards a European federal state. I think this is a long-term vision. This might be a sort of a guiding principle, but I don't see Germany putting its emphasis of its European policy there. I think the real emphasis is sort of be a more active player in the community method. You have the EU in a lot of other policy areas, on climate, on energy, and digitalization. So in many other policy areas outside of the EU chapter, there's a strong EU element in there. And I think the government sort of has as its core mission this modernization idea of Germany, but to some extent also of Europe. And a lot of the policies that the German government wants to do in these modernizing areas will have to be played through the European area. And I think this is where Germany will be most active, trying to drive the agenda. And we're now sort of in the second part of the legislative period of the Commission von der Leyen. We have the big legislative proposals on the table on the Green Deal, on digitalization, on social Europe. And I think this is where Germany will transition more from this status quo area power to one who wants to drive the debate more forward and be more of a reform motor. And I would be very surprised if sort of we see a big drive really behind this idea of the federal Europe. I think it will be more on these sort of legislative files where the new government has a real stake to play.
And to follow up, with whom does the German government want to put this in practice? I mean, who are the key interlocutors? Who's the Spitzengruppe that Germany wants to form to help deliver on that agenda?
I think the core idea, if I can see it from the outside, is still to be sort of at the center of Europe, not only geographically, but also politically. You saw that in the first trips of both the Chancellor and the foreign ministers going to Paris, Brussels, and then Warsaw in that order. And so I think the idea of the new German government is still to sit at the center of Europe, move a little bit more towards Macron, a little bit more coordination with the reformist camp in the EU, but still play a bridge builder that cooperates, for instance, with the Netherlands and the Frugals and the Hanse, that still looks towards the Nordics, still wants to talk with Warsaw and not completely cut ties over the rule of law with Poland and Hungary. So I think it's in a sense Germany no longer wants to be a status quo, but a reformist power, but still wants to be the bridge builder that brokers the compromises in the EU. And the challenge will be to make that work, because I think as a status quo power, it was sometimes easier for Germany to build blocking coalitions that could block too ambitious reforms. If you want to be a reformist power, you really need to build coalitions that actively build majorities, and this will be a much tougher task than I think sometimes the blocking minorities that the previous government built on a lot of issues.
Ambassador Nunn, Nikolai kindly mentioned 2.5 groupings of which the Netherlands is a part of, the Frugals, the Hanse, and the Netherlands themselves. Where does the Netherlands fit in into this German Rubik's Cube in terms of getting Europe in gear?
Before answering this question, I have to say that 30 years of diplomatic service learn you as a German diplomat that there is always a certain tension between the wish to serve and the wish to take initiatives. And so we are serving, and in the paper, the coalition paper, there is also written serving the European Union and taking initiatives. My last job in Cairo, the German government took the initiative in Libya, but it took it in the sense of serving a purpose and bringing in the parties. So taking initiative in my diplomatic experience is less to achieve goals which we have in Berlin, which we want to achieve, economical goals, military goals, migration goals, but to serve for a solution and to invite a group of countries. So I wanted to make this point. Now, when it comes to the Netherlands, since I'm here, I'm naturally fully of the opinion that the Netherlands should be at the am Quertisch, so at the main table. The many discussions I had with many stakeholders here showed me that, at least in the last 3-4 months, there's an appetite for that. There is an understanding that being drowned in the Baltic Sea doesn't bring you where the decisions are taken. There is an understanding that this country has the ability and also the historical right, being a foundator, to be at the main table. And there is a willingness to accept that to be at the center table means naturally that you have to come with compromise in your mind. You have to come at the table already with a compromise in your mind, bringing in your points and having a compromise in your mind. I think that the opportunity to come to that point is far bigger now than before. And I would presume that a government like the German government would welcome that, because there are many parts where we would indeed work together on the same melody in a greater group of countries where the melody might be a little bit different.
Thank you. And before we start talking about a topic which I am very curious also to get Mr. Fricke's views on, namely Eurozone policy, I want to, first of all, welcome very warmly Kati Peri to our panel. Thank you so much for joining us, Kati. Kati Peri is, of course, the foreign affairs spokesperson for the Dutch Social Democrats in the Dutch House of Parliament. The question I'd put to you, you've heard some of the conversation that we've had regarding say Germany's new role in Europe, and also a little bit expectations with respect to the Netherlands and the role that the Netherlands can play. Given what you know about Dutch EU policy, and given what you've also read perhaps in the coalition agreement that was published this afternoon, do you think that we're ready to play that role at the Quertisch, at the center table on European affairs?
Well, thank you very much, Rem, for first of all your warm welcome words and for this invitation. And I really have to apologize for coming in very, very late. Well, to come immediately to answer your question, I think at least if you look at the wordings of the Europe paragraph, you would say that yes, there is a willingness to do so. On the other hand, these are, of course, the same 4 parties which formed the Dutch government also the last 4 years, where we always chose a different coalition. Already, I remember at the beginning when both Berlin and Paris were discussing about the recovery fund, I think the reaction of the Dutch Prime Minister was, well, this is one of the ideas that is being floated, but there are many other ideas. Well, to say that about a German-French initiative, I think doesn't really put things in the correct order. So I very much hope so. I think there is a need for it as well. I think what I also always appreciated, and what will certainly be a continuity in German politics, is that you see that German politicians in general, irrespective of the party, whether it's the old coalition or the new coalition in Berlin, there is a responsibility feeling that it's not just about national politics. There is this German responsibility feeling of wanting to be also a constructive player in Europe. And that, I think, is something that is sometimes a bit lacking in Holland. It's also probably because we don't always realize, also we still see ourselves somehow as a small nation, while in terms of economy, we are one of the biggest. And of course, also in terms of the founding six, I think the responsibility for a new Dutch government would be to look for that alliance, certainly with Berlin, hopefully also in the coming months ahead, of course, depending also on what the outcome will be of the French elections. Because our interests lie together. So let's see if we will have a state secretary for Europe. It looks like we won't have the minister for Europe, but there was. If you look at what is now in the Dutch coalition government on Europe, at least the ingredients are there to play a constructive role.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just to follow up, perhaps, there is a new set of winds blowing through Europe. We have a new German government. We also have a revamped Franco-Italian alliance. We saw that German ministers visited Paris, Brussels, Warsaw first. Where does the Netherlands fit in? And perhaps I can make it more specific, because we have one question posed by one of our participants, by Jared Rijkseidler. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. And the question is, how should we see the triangulation of the new German-Dutch relationship on EU affairs vis-a-vis France? The EU chapter of the German coalition is very progressive and matches many French ambitions. The French are increasingly working with the Dutch as well. And Rutte and Macron are from the same EU-level political family. So how should we perhaps put more focus on that new triangle between The Hague, Paris, and Berlin, as opposed to what seems to be getting a lot of attention now, a new triangle between Paris, Berlin, and Rome?
Well, obviously, as a Dutch politician, who would be against that, right? Now, I think Rome is and continues to be, of course, very important. Also, when it comes to European affairs and the way Europe will need to continue the reforms. But for me, what is, Mark Rutte, irrespective of the party that he's also heading, apart from being the prime minister, is one of the, I think together with Viktor Orban, now the longest serving prime ministers in Europe. And what we have seen is that slowly, it took some years, but slowly the Europeanization of Mark Rutte has also been more into view in Dutch politics and in Dutch parliament, in debates. I think, as we all know, the second biggest party in the Netherlands is, I think, an outspoken pro-European party, which of course has a bigger part in this coalition, as they have more seats than in the last government. So I very much hope, not just through party politics, I would say, through the liberal family, but in general, that the first reaction of the Dutch government will not be how can we block what we don't like in Europe, but to start thinking about what is it that we want with Europe and how can we come to a coalition and who are our friends in that. And it would be very naive to think that if policy proposals are being brought up and initiatives are being taken by Berlin and Paris, that these are not serious initiatives where it would be wiser from the start to be at the table and discuss them, rather than to look for small blocking alliances, which in the end will probably not last, as well as we saw with the with what happened, of course, with the recovery fund and the Dutch position there. So I think by now also Mark Rutte, I think he has the respect in Europe to be at the main table, but it also takes a little bit more leadership and a little bit more guts to sometimes also tell the true story also to the Dutch public and the Dutch parliament, why you think that certain European solutions are necessary. I think for a start, what I just one last remark from my side, Rem, where I have been more critical of the last German government, where I'm more hopeful about the coming in coalition, where Macron has just visited, as you know, Budapest last week, where he also met with the opposition. He made clear statements about the recovery fund not being given out before the Hungarian elections. This is a point where I also would like to see, Berlin speak up more, like I think what happened already in the coalition agreement when it comes to the rule of law. And this is something where also the Dutch have always taken a clear position. So to start with an alliance on how to rebuild the main foundations on the rule of law in Europe, I think would be a very good start for this cooperation.
That's a very good and useful suggestion, I think, which hopefully resonates in Berlin. I'd like to bring in Mr. Frieke on this question of, say, the frugals, the role of the Netherlands. Of course, there is a huge amount of interest in the policies that Mr. Lindner is going to be pursuing at the Finanzamt. There is some in the Netherlands say that he is kind of a friend of the Netherlands in the way he approaches the Eurozone, but there is also a certain degree of uncertainty. Previously, you've also been on Dutch television, kind of hinting at a perhaps somewhat, I can't remember the exact word, but perhaps somewhat antagonistic role between the Netherlands and Germany, also on these issues. What's your take? I mean, where are we going in terms of Germany's approach towards the economic and monetary union, and where does the Netherlands fit in?
Well, one of the pages, or one page I deeply looked into, was the page where I was trying to find out how the Netherlands will act in the future of Europe. And this one page is not very intense. It gives a little bit of more rights to the European Parliament. It says something, little steps that are given about the rule of law and things like that, but there is not a real reform, and I have to look through the addendum, the finance paper that is given there too. Maybe that will give a hint, but I can't see that. My problem right now is, as Goethe said, if you don't move forward, you fall back, you can't stay. And within the Netherlands, if it was about Europe, not about the economical parts of Europe, it was very often discussion, oh, we don't have to change, everything's fine, it's going to go on. This is not going to work. And this is what this coalition states here too. This is where we are progressive too. We do know things have to change. Now, the question within this coalition, of course, is that with the FDP, you have a party that says the Stability and Growth Pact is the basis, is the fundament for us, first Germany, with our way of acting on the financial level. So we can change this fundament. We can add it. We can modernize it. We have to see that, of course, the economy is not as it has been when the Stability and Growth Pact was founded. Where I was referring to in Buitenhof was another problem. And it was not an antagonistic part of the Netherlands towards Germany. It was an antagonistic part in the leadership role of the frugals against the others. Why that? Because if Germany, and here I refer again to this leaning on, if Germany only has friends as the one remaining soul really strong power within the European Union, it has at the end always to find solutions that fit with France. Anything else would be a disaster for Europe if in public there would be a fight between France and Germany on where Europe is going to. A. B. But without Great Britain being there anymore, who then will lead at the end? Those who say, hey, what France and Germany said there, we have to discuss this. It's a democracy. It's not a federation yet. By the way, every country defines federation in a different way coming from its own history. But the role for the Netherlands here is to be the leader of those that are more antagonistic. And other than before with this triangle, Great Britain, France, Germany, sometimes Italy, it is not as easy as it has been for the Netherlands to lean on one or the other side, which they did since the so-called Rampjaar.
Thanks for clarifying that. I recognize that there is still uncertainty regarding German financial policy towards the Eurozone. Because on the one hand, yes, there have been comments about the Strategic and Growth Pact being central. On the other hand, the FT picked this up and made a big thing out of it, that Lindner also opened the possibility for additional investments. Nikolai, can I bring you in on this? What is your assessment of how we should value German EMU policy?
So I think if you read the part about the EMU in the EU chapter of the coalition treaty, it's probably the least reformist part of the coalition chapter. There's a lot of statement on what is currently on the table in the EU. So for instance, on the recovery fund, it says it's a temporary measure, one-off for crisis management. But I think what's crucial is that it also doesn't contain a lot of red lines. So it doesn't say no to using an instrument like the recovery fund in the future for crisis. It doesn't say fundamentally no to new EU own resources. And so there is some leeway for the new German government to adapt on how the policy discussion on the EU level goes. And I think this is, for me, the interesting part about that. The second part is coming a little bit back to the discussion about Germany, France, and the Netherlands. For me, the Franco-German engine has always been most successful, not when Berlin and Paris agreed with each other, but when they came from different sides to find a compromise that most of the EU could work with. And I think a Germany that would move too far to the French position on the EMU would no longer be able to find compromises with France that work for most of the Eurozone. And so I think this is where The Hague could come into. Germany moved a little bit into the French direction, but not all the way. And I think this is important. Germany can still play the bridge builder on EMU. And together with The Hague and Paris, I think you have three countries that sort of could represent the whole of thinking in the Eurozone about economic policy. And this is where I think compromises could come in. But a German EMU policy that would go all the way towards Macron, I think would no longer be able to play this crucial role of finding compromises that could work for the whole EMU or even the whole EU 27.
René, do you agree with Nikolai's assessment that the Netherlands could potentially play that third balancing role to complete a holy trinity in terms of moving European monetary policy forward?
I'm not so sure. I think it's a bit over promising for the Netherlands, but I want to bring in another point, because we should be careful about the forces which are there in Europe. If there's a huge asymmetry at the moment between Germany and France. In Germany, the elections were an election about within the political center, but in France, you see the establishment fighting for its political existence. Macron versus Zemmour and Le Pen. Completely different political arena. And the forces in France are completely incomparable to the political forces in Germany. So this Franco-German axis is very asymmetrical at the moment. And Macron cannot afford to speak about climate transition in France. He has to speak about migration. And so we should be careful about the forces which are underneath this debate on the future of Europe, that there still is this legacy of Kohl and Merkel of Zusammenhalt. So I completely agree with Nicolai. There are limits to integration. I also think that naming the federal Bundesstaat of Europe is not very helpful for bridge building in Europe. This is enforcing the populist forces in East and also in the North. So I think Germany should stick to its bridge building position, not being a status quo power, but a reformist power, but not using words like federalism to please the French, because you are therefore endangering the legacy of Merkel and Kohl in Germany in the long run. That would be my position here.
Thanks for that. Jana, I see you shaking your head.
No, I just think it's a fundamental mistake to think that the federal state, a European state, is in there to please the French. I think that is not what is behind this. It's a long-standing claim of the FDP and of the Greens under different names. And then in the coalition, kind of, I think the term that was then found is a new construct that none of the parties had in their party program. But I think it's really a mirroring kind of the pro-EU and deeper EU integration orientation of the three parties, but especially also of the FDP and the Greens. And I think it's not to please the French. And I think actually there will be a hell lot of problems with the French, not only when it comes to Macron pushing for the kind of to loosen the Stability and Growth Pact and to make next generation EU a role model for the future. It will also be very much about taxonomy and kind of the nuclear energy issue and the question whether that can count as green energy or not. That is kind of one of the major kind of points of tension between Germany and France, and also when it comes to the future of kind of the European Defense Union. The new German government has very ambitious ideas about tightening the rule for arms export, not only on the national, but also on the European level. That is not a kind of, that doesn't make the French happy, I can assure you. So the whole vision of kind of European defense is very different, looking at the German coalition treaty and the ambition that's coming from the French government. So I think that there are kind of, there is a lot of tension in the cards as well. And if you look at this last word, the strategic sovereignty that the German coalition treaty mentions so prominently, it's not the same concept that the French have entirely. So, for example, security and defense is missing when it's defined. And Annalena Baerbock has taken this out when she explained what that means in the speech you referred to, Rem, in the very beginning, when she addressed kind of the Auswärtiges Amt for the first time. So I think it's not exactly, we're not exactly embarking on a French course here.
So Germany is not exactly embarking on a French course. And France is, of course, facing a period of some political uncertainty. But Kati, could the Netherlands perhaps make, even if they're kind of tiny baby steps, towards both Germany and France? I mean, I read the new coalition agreement this afternoon, and I was struck by some of the words, particularly also related to EUEMU policy, which kind of resonate what Mr. Fricke was talking about and what Mr. Lindner mentioned, kind of betting on both horses, saying reforms are possible, but the Stability and Growth Pact is sacrosanct, sort of keeping options open. At the same time, you see the Netherlands also engaged in a new diplomatic renaissance with France. So rather than that, France and Germany start taking the Netherlands more seriously, could it perhaps also be that the Netherlands is becoming both more French and more German at the same time?
Well, it's an honor that you asked this question to an opposition politician, right? And who is not part of this government. But look, I think the visions on Europe when it comes to the four parties forming the coalition are not that far apart as it sometimes seems in the national debate. At least if you look at their European families, where I used to work in the European Parliament for 7 years. Obviously, I'm not an expert when it comes to the economic field, where obviously there are, of course, also big debates in the Netherlands. But on certain issues, if there would be a willingness to move forward, for instance, I found it interesting that not so long ago, I think it was more or less a year ago, suddenly there was this paper with Spain, right? That the Dutch government had together written. I think it came from the foreign ministers on how to look at strategic autonomy. And this, for me, was a willingness to say that we are not only wanting. There is a tendency not only wanting to be at the frugal side and at the blocking side and at the not wanting things, and also sometimes more look forward and pave forward that discussion with other partners. And I think that's a healthy situation. Also, obviously, Paris and Berlin are key players, but there are more other key players and mid-size important players in Europe, and you also need to bridge that gap. Whether it will happen, that's we are on day one of at least reading what the four parties have agreed on paper, and on paper it all looks positive when it comes to the Europe chapter, I would say. But the pudding is always in the eating. And the last 4 years, like I said, irrespective of also having the same prime minister, the same pro-European D66 in the coalition, we didn't always see it work. So I try to be as neutral as possible and not as politically loaded in my remarks. But I think in general, for the whole coalition agreement, if you look at it today, not only when it comes to foreign policy, the question is, well, will they be able to deliver? And that is the big question, I think, hanging around above this coalition agreement. And the same principle applies to when it comes to obviously mainly Prime Minister Rutte's role in Europe and the role that this coalition government wants to continue to play there.
I thank you very much for being frank in your response. That's also why we invite you here, not to be the opposition politician, but the foreign policy expert that you are. The question I think comes after this is the Netherlands investing enough in terms of its ability to make its voice heard in places like Berlin or Paris? And it connects with a question that's come in from the participants, from and I hope I pronounced this correct, from Lieven Tayi. And the question relates to the role that perhaps the Benelux could play, sort of as an amplifier or a consensus builder of views between, say, Northern European perspectives and others. The Benelux has oftentimes played this role of being a testing area to move European policy forward. Could the Benelux also play a role in terms of influencing Franco-German dynamics? Or how do you see this broader question of how we get the Dutch voice across most effectively in Berlin?
In Berlin or in Europe?
Well, we're talking about Dutch-German relations. So,
okay.
But,
in Berlin.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that I see is that when it comes to the think tank level, it's there. So that's very often, where ideas are being initiated, and this is a compliment, I think, to Klingendaal and some of the other think tanks we have in Holland, that there is a clear willingness and wantingness to work together, obviously, with German think tanks. Benelux myself, this is now the second parliament I'm in, never been in the Benelux parliament. It's like the people who we see in the Baltics, or when it comes to the South Caucasus, we see them as a region, but we ourselves in the region never see ourselves as being part of the Benelux, right? So it's not the first thing, obviously, that comes to my mind. I think when it comes to political parties, I know for sure that for my political party and the Greens with which we closely cooperate, of course, also the fact that two of our sister parties in Germany are now in the coalition agreement means that this is now the most important political family that we want to even further tighten ties with at a very important and critical moment, I think, for Europe. Now, when it comes to the government, I sometimes have the feeling when it comes to, but I'm sure many viewers know much more about this, or experts in the panel, but the ministries, let alone the ministers who meet sometimes, obviously, also the German, Dutch ministers. I'm sure, for instance, on defense, there has always been a lot of cooperation, I'm sure, in other fields. But when it comes to the ministries, to the bureaucracy, so to say, of the state apparatus, I think there's so much more that we can do to come closer together. And that is unfortunately a culture that I don't see very actively being, that the Netherlands is very engaged with, how to learn, how to cooperate from our big neighbors. And you have seen it, of course, in the Corona crisis, but that was really at the height of the crisis, not having enough intensive care beds in the Netherlands, and how can our neighbors help? But this would, this could be so much useful, not just at the political level, but also at parliament level. I know the German parliament, Bundestag, has some close relations with other parliaments. We have seen, of course, what the German Bundestag has been setting up with the French assembly. This is an area where it would be very, very interesting to have much closer contact also between the legislators themselves as well.
And I guess that's an open invitation to Otto Fricke to either come to The Hague or
warmly welcome.
Help get that parliamentary dialogue up and running.
Well, you would wonder, and even though I've been in this now outgoing year, I've been 12 times to the Netherlands, 10 of these times to The Hague, and if Ambassador Nunn wouldn't be such an ambassador running around in his new country that much, I would have met him way more often than I already did. But there is one problem. The problem on the parliament side is that the Dutch parliament is a classical working parliament every week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That is the problem compared to Germany. We have 1 week from Monday to Friday, and then most of the time we have 1 week off where we can go to the Netherlands for at least 2 or 3 days. This is why, for example, I visited in my life now 12 VVD parliamentary group meetings. And that is why I know a lot of people there, and why I said in this place down on the floor. The problem really is getting Dutch people over. It's not the problem getting German members over. When I asked my parliamentary group leader, my new parliamentary group leader, what was the same with Lindner, hey, listen, I have a chance on Tuesday, Wednesday to go over there, watch the debate on European affairs and visit the parliamentary group of my sister parties, D66 and VVD, that works. If any Dutch liberal comes over and says, hey, any chance on Tuesday I can join your parliamentary group meeting, it's not a problem. The problem is on Tuesday, he has to be in The Hague.
It's fascinating as an outsider to hear that some of the obstacles are actually pretty recognizable, but also somewhat down to earth. And I can imagine these scheduling issues can be resolved with a bit of goodwill. So if anything, let's hope that that's a result of this event. We've now come to the phase of our discussion where the audience is asking fantastic questions that I want to give a chance to respond to. So I'm going to group two questions, and I'm going to ask Mr. Fricke and Mr. Nunn to take them on. And it has to do with kind of what do we expect of the Dutch-German relationship, and more specifically, what's the next big thing that should happen to foster cooperation between the two governments? And this is specifically asked by Ulf Jensen, but Marijn Visser asked a similar question, more framed at what economic fields should Germany and the Netherlands work together on. There's an innovation pact between Germany and the Netherlands, but does this need an upgrade? Should we perhaps be talking about other hot topics in industrial policy world, for instance, on semiconductors? So if you look in your crystal ball, what are the big sort of bilateral plans that the Netherlands and Germany could take on to help move Europe forward? Who of you, Ambassador Nunn?
Okay, I'll start. So when it comes to the economics, this is the first topic you're confronted here as German ambassador when you arrive here. You have first 80% of economics, all the companies, all the stakeholders, all the regions, all the harbors, all the airlines, all the airports are coming to you, all the tourist operators are coming to you. And then you realize after 1 week, wow, this is really big and important. So if you take that as a huge cake and you read that together with our government agreements, and you see what is written into that, and you see what both governments have ahead of them in terms of green economy, in terms of new channels of transporting energy, in terms of infrastructure, digitalization, you have it all. Just one little example. We are just negotiating right now between the harbor of Rotterdam and the cities of Jülich for the one and another German city in West Germany, contracts about building infrastructure in a worth of more than 1 billion each in order to transport future energy. So if you're interested in that, it's an immense field, and it's a field which will have a lot of traction. It's not always very visible, but it's enormous. It's a lot. It's working well. There's a lot to be done. So who is interested can delve into that. Now the big splash in order to make our countries, well, the big splash is always a good soccer game. Naturally, that's the best you can get if you want to have visibility. Now, since I'm a German ambassador here, I wish naturally the Netherlands to win. Before that, I would have said that differently. But I think that politically, if we manage to have the Dutch government implicated in European business, I'm creative, as I said, in a way which is more proactive, more visible, more challenging its own ideas, its fears, its readiness to participate, its willingness to take others on board, then you will be part of the big equilibrium in Europe. The big equilibrium is not only France and Germany, it is also Italy, it is also Poland, and it should be, that is what I say to my partners here, it should be also the Netherlands. That would be the big splash, because there you would have a visibility in the decision-making, you would have an influence in the decision-making, and you would have a visibility also when the decisions are taken, which are not yet given.
Thank you for that, and also for mentioning a number of very specific examples. Mr. Fricke, does anything pop into your mind when it comes to sort of big splash things that the Netherlands and the Germans could do? Say, I don't know to what extent, given your role in the budget committee, you come across the Netherlands a lot. I don't know to what extent the Netherlands is very visible in Berlin. I mean, aside from a football match, I could also imagine a meeting between Toto Wolff and Max Verstappen might be, or Mercedes and Max Verstappen might be interesting. Any suggestions on a more serious note on how we can get that bilateral relationship to pick up a gear?
Okay, first I'll do a little provocation. I thought Max Verstappen was a Belgian guy, but was caught by the Dutch. Anywho, the interesting thing is, and the big problem is, the Netherlands are the second largest trade partner, and nobody in Germany knows. And that is a huge problem. The problem is that not only existing because Germans very often look size-wise. Most people do it. The real problem is the Dutch are very often in the area of, well, it doesn't matter if they don't see us that big as long as we can do the business. Yet I think it is of utmost importance that the new Dutch government tells Germany, hey, yeah, your biggest trade partner you give a maximum of attention, but your second biggest, you're like, yeah, well, it's just Rotterdam, it's our products going through there, which is completely wrong. Two, if you look right now in the debate on Twitter and anything in Germany on the coalition treaty in the Netherlands, you know what's the biggest issue? It's energy, and here it's nuclear. That there in our country, we shut down. I'm not putting any position. We have a decision made. We shut down 3 nuclear power plants, and your coalition treaty says we're going to prepare 2 new power plants, and the existing one is going to run longer. I get things like, oh, you and your Dutch friend, they're all crazy. Yet, you know what the second answer to that issue is? Well, not stupid, them Dutch. They're going to sell us in the future when we don't have enough nuclear energy. And this is one issue that is very important, because if we have combined energy market, and this is because it is definitely necessary, a more and more electricity market, because this is the only way we can really transfer to a carbon-free energy system, then the relation between Germany and the Netherlands here will play a very large role, not only where we put too much wind, if we have it, where we put it to it, but also how we get it from the West. And if you then see the connection that our largest grid supplier is owned by the finance minister, who probably will now come from D66, then that is very interesting. And one last thing, why didn't the Germans visit the Netherlands yet? It is not good on a diplomatic side to visit a government where you do know it could be a new one within the next weeks. Yet keep in mind, of course, Mark and Christian, Lindner and Rutte already did a lot of text messages going.
Right, great. That's fantastic. Also, very strong messages for our Dutch audience. We're slowly running out of time, but I want to squeeze in 2 final questions from our participants. One is so important it was raised twice in the Q&A, and that has to do with EU-Turkey relations. So we're going to transition a little bit to the traditional foreign policy realm again. And is there? I mean, both the Netherlands and Germany have a large, sizable Turkish community. Do Germany and the Netherlands continue to see eye to eye when it comes to the EU relationship with Turkey? I would love to get Kati Peri's views on this, because I know that she is by far more expert on EU-Turkey relations than I am. But I don't know to what extent perhaps Nikolai or one of the other panelists wants to chip in on this. The final question, it has to do with Nord Stream 2, but I'm going to frame it a little bit differently. And it has to do with a question that Jana put on the table, namely, who makes German foreign policy? René also mentioned there are 4 foreign ministers. Is it the Kanzleramt, or is it the Auswärtiges Amt that's going to be more important, particularly also on sensitive issues like Russia? And I'd like to get Nikolai and René's views on this, and maybe Ambassador Nunn to chip in as well. But Kati, on EU-Turkey, perhaps you first.
Yes, because the last question is fueling the tensions between, as we say in Holland, the left cloud, right, between the Greens and the Social Democrats. So I leave that one to the others. Now, when it comes to Turkey, I think what has always been interesting is that if you look at the voting behavior of those people who go to vote in both Germany and in the Netherlands, of the people, Germans and Dutch with Turkish roots, we have a much larger AKP, Erdogan's party support than inside Turkey. However, if you look in Europe, we always have also the most critical governments when it comes to the policies of President Erdogan. So I think somehow having, and on the other hand, I think, for instance, in Britain, you always have a big Kurdish community there, and who are obviously very critical of the government. And I think London has always been much more friendly when it comes to Ankara. So one thing does not necessarily translate to others. How I know the Green colleagues and the FDP and the SPD colleagues from the European Parliament, Turkey being where it is, I don't think there will be a lot of differences among the political parties. Because I think we all agree that in this way, there's not a lot that you can do in terms of positive steps when it comes to Turkey. What has been sometimes my frustration as a European parliamentarian, as the rapporteur for Turkey, is the very, very pragmatic view we sometimes take, often led also by Berlin, where migration played a key role in defining our relationship with Turkey, and where I have the feeling that we are losing the Democrats and the civil society in that country. For me, and Rem, you know him as well, a good friend of mine, Osman Kavala, who is now in prison for more than 4 years. And we haven't been able as an EU to even get that person out of this miserable situation in Turkey. I think is very telling that has perhaps not been, and I understand it has never been our only and sole concern, but it's also telling about that because of migration, because of a lot of other interests that are at stake, obviously with such a big neighbor, we haven't always been very vocal, and we lose the trust of many Turkish Democrats. But as long as Ankara is heading the direction it is heading, we will continue to have very critical voices, I assume, from both Berlin and from The Hague, from both governments. And that means also always tension with part of the people living in our countries who actually follow and support the policies that are being done by Erdogan. So I don't see a lot of difference from how it was under Chancellor Merkel and how it will be under Olaf Scholz. I think this is a continuum because of the bad situation in Turkey. If things would be very good in Turkey, you would see the political differences again with what kind of ambitious relationship we would want to have with the country.
Thank you for that. And in the interest of time, we're going to take that last question very, very quickly on the relationship between Auswärtiges Amt and Kanzleramt in terms of shaping German foreign policy on key issues like, for instance, Nord Stream 2. Nikolai, can I ask for your thoughts on this? And this is going to be the last round. So if one of the other speakers feels the need to come in on this, please give me a sign, because we don't want to eat into too much of our audience's time.
So then I'll try to be brief. I think the honest answer is that the Auswärtiges Amt certainly has lost power in the German system. It used to be that the vice chancellery would always be the Auswärtiges Amt. It wasn't in the last legislative period. They had moved to the finance ministry. Now it's the climate and energy ministry. And in the negotiations, it was clear that the Auswärtiges Amt was more a negotiation factor rather than the price to be gained by the smaller parties. Therefore, I would argue, yes, it has lost that huge influence. And you can see this week where we have the huge discussion over Ukraine. They're moving in the European Council. There's talk about the Normandy format. And so clearly, I think, on these core powers of foreign policy, the geostrategic questions, the chancellery will play the strong role. But I would say where the Auswärtiges Amt will maybe be a little bit stronger is on climate policy. There was a big move of climate foreign policy into the Auswärtiges Amt. And I think they will be stronger sort of in combination with the climate and economy ministry on EU legislative issues, where the foreign ministry sort of in tandem with the other green ministry, I think will play a stronger role than the Auswärtiges Amt has played in the past.
Thank you. And mirrored to this, René, what's more important in terms of shaping Dutch foreign policy, the Dutch foreign ministry or the cabinet office or the prime minister's office?
Of course, the last, of course, but the luck of the foreign ministry in the Netherlands is that we don't have a Chancellor Amt. It's a very small ministry around Mark Rutte. So the foreign ministry is preparing a lot of policies for the prime minister. That's good luck for the foreign ministry in the Netherlands. So hard to compare, but in European affairs we see that it's chefsache. The prime ministers and the government leaders are there in charge, and that's, I think, an overall development all over the world. The foreign ministries are marginalizing and are becoming more for domestic use only. Realpolitiek in the Chancellor Amt and human rights and climate policies, especially for domestic use. And I don't think that's a positive development.
It's something to mull over, definitely. Ambassador Nunn, do you have any final reflections on this?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with the two speakers before me. From the point of view I represent, it is also rather regrettable, but it is like that. I served 4 years with Rutte and as his head of unit for European integration. And at that time, already the power relation was based on a man with 42% of the votes and a man with 9%, and two very strong personalities, one having en plus the numbers. And you remember he said Koch and Kellner, and he was the boss. And he made indeed the real policy. What is interesting is that the Kanzleramt is full of people from the Auswärtiges Amt, transfugers, if you want, so who go back to so it's the same personnel. It's us who man the whole business. But for some years, then you change your hat and then you switch your loyalty. So I think in real terms, that's where the future power politics base will be in German foreign policy, I presume, yes.
Thank you. And with that, that's unfortunately going to have to bring our event to a close, which we had to organize in an online fashion. We would have loved to have brought all of you to The Hague in order to have a live event. We will continue to monitor very closely the German-Dutch relationship and German foreign affairs in general. And so you can be sure that we will, once COVID permits us, start to reconvene discussions of this sort in a live fashion. It would also be hopefully a fantastic opportunity to bring Mr. Fricke for his 13th visit to the Netherlands in a short period of time. And perhaps we can also contribute a little bit to that interparliamentary dialogue and involve Kati and other MPs as well. If anything, I thought this was a fantastically rich conversation. We covered a lot of ground. Thank you to all the speakers. Unfortunately, Jana's router collapsed, so that's why I wasn't able to bring her into the conversation anymore. But in spirit, she's with us. If anything, one of the takeaways is that the Netherlands should invest more in its visibility in Berlin. We should get those agendas, those parliamentary agendas aligned, and simply continue the dialogue, because sometimes we do seem to take each other a little bit for granted. And in this new European context, it's very important to invest not just in those that are far away, but those that are very close by as well. And that's definitely the case with respect to the Netherlands and Germany. And so with that, let me once again thank very much Jana Puglerin, Kati Peri, Nicolai van Ondorza, Otto Fricke, Ambassador Nunn, and René Cuperes. And thank you, all of you online for joining us.